The Clockwork Architect. The town of Ethelberg was defined by its reputation, not by its cobblestone streets or its famous river eels, but by the relentless, humming judgment of its citizens. Ethelbergians didn't just speak, they decreed. Their words didn't simply describe you, they defined you, casting you in permanent roles as fixed and brittle as the porcelain dolls in the mayor's parlor. And no one was more thoroughly defined than Silas Fallow. From the age of 8, Silas was labeled the scatterbrain. It started when he tried to build a self-watering flower box for his mother. He wired the copper tubing wrong, and instead of a gentle mist, the device fired a torrent of river water directly through the kitchen window. The local gossip, Mrs. Elms, saw it happen. "Oh, poor Clara Fallow," she'd sighed dramatically to anyone who would listen. "Her Silas is a complete scatterbrain. Couldn't organize a pair of socks, let alone a proper invention." The word stuck to Silas like fresh tar. When he earned a respectable mark in mathematics, the teacher would say, "A fluke, perhaps, for a scatterbrain." When he forgot his lunch, it was proof. When he just sat quietly, thinking, he was clearly too scattered to speak. By the time he was 22, Silas had adopted the label as a second skin. He was disorganized. He spoke in fits and starts. He avoided eye contact, afraid that the intensity of his real thoughts, which were vast, intricate, and concerned with gears, tension, and perpetual motion, would only prove how utterly scattered he was. He found work sweeping floors at the town's only successful enterprise, the Ethelberg Clockworks. It was a job that required no thought, no creativity, and most importantly, no organization. The precision of failure. The Clockworks was run by an old tyrant named Master Helm. Helm's clockmaking philosophy was simple: perfection, derived from conformity. Every clock was identical. Every gear was milled to the same ancient specification. They were precise, dull, and utterly lifeless. Silas, the scatterbrain, worked in the back, where the old, broken pieces were discarded. It was his sanctuary. While sweeping, his eyes weren't on the floor. They were on the trash. He saw beauty in the discarded complexity. A broken escapement wheel, a warped balance spring, a brass plate that had been rejected for being a hair too thin. In a hidden, dusty corner of the workshop, underneath a collapsed pile of canvas sacks, Silas began to build. He wasn't building a clock, he was building a machine to prove the world wrong. He called it the mnemonic engine. It was a clockwork sculpture, standing nearly 6 feet tall, built entirely from salvaged parts. It had 7 independent faces, each one telling time in a different way. One with water dripping into tiny cups, one with magnets swinging weights, one with colored sand falling into hourglasses. It was a riot of motion and purpose, organized not by straight lines and perfect symmetry, but by complex, interconnected dependencies. Every scattered piece had a vital role in the whole. The machine was organized not by the eye, but by the math. It was, in a word, the anti-Ethelberg clock. It was beautiful, chaotic, and it worked. For months, he built in secret, using the silence of the night shift. He felt a sharp, giddy anxiety whenever Master Helm drew near. If Helm saw this, he wouldn't see innovation. He would see a waste of salvage, the disorganized efforts of a scatterbrain, and he would destroy it. The new definition, then came the new word, courtesy of the mayor's wife, who had seen Silas arguing clumsily with a baker about the price of rye bread. The new word was the simpleton. "Silas Fallow," she declared at the market square, shaking her head. "He's a simpleton. He can't even conduct a basic transaction. Such a shame he's too simple to do anything but sweep." The new definition was heavier than the old one. "Scatterbrain" suggested a mess that might, one day, be tidied. "Simpleton" suggested a limit, a permanent, immovable boundary to his mind. The phrase echoed in the workshop, too simple to do anything but sweep. Silas began to falter. The complex gears of the mnemonic engine seemed to mock him. How can a simpleton build this? The internal conflict was a grinding sound louder than any clock. He started to believe them. Maybe the machine was a fluke. Maybe he was too simple to finish it. He left the final, crucial component, the central balance mechanism, unfinished for nearly a week. He didn't sweep the floors. He just stared at the machine, the weight of the town's word pinning him to the floor. One cold Tuesday, Master Helm gathered the staff in the main hall. "The annual royal inspection is in 3 days," Helm announced, his voice dry as dust. "Ethelberg clocks must be flawless, or the royal contract is rescinded. Today, we polish, we prepare, and we conform to expectation." The staff nodded with the fearful compliance Ethelbergians were famous for. But that evening, disaster struck. A critical earth tremor, small but sharp, rolled through the valley. It didn't damage the stone buildings, but it did something worse. It momentarily jammed the ancient main regulating mechanism for the entire clockworks. Suddenly, every clock in Ethelberg, the town that prided itself on perfect time, began to run wildly, randomly fast and slow. The town was thrown into a panic. Dinner was served at 4 p.m. Children were sent to school at midnight. Chaos reigned. Master Helm frantically opened the regulator housing, sweat beading on his temples. The mainspring! It seized! The vibration must have twisted the arbor just enough to bind the mainspring barrel. He looked at his staff, a collection of perfect, compliant clockmakers. "Someone get it loose. Carefully. If we damage the spring, the contract is gone." The chief clockmakers, men who had spent 30 years making the same gear, stared blankly. They knew how to build the spring, but not how to fix a seizure born of unexpected trauma. They were great conformists, but poor problem solvers. The intervention, Silas watched the scarlet fear pulsing around Helm, and the cool, dull confusion hanging over the other staff. He felt the familiar weight of the simpleton on his shoulders. "Stay back, simpleton. Don't speak, scatterbrain." But then he looked at the jammed mainspring. It was a thick coil of steel, twisted in a subtle, near-invisible way. His eyes, trained for months on the subtle, twisted physics of his own mnemonic engine, saw the problem instantly. "The arbor has shifted," Silas heard himself say, his voice shaking. He pointed, not to the spring, but to a minuscule bearing plate at the rear. "It's the lateral tension. The plate needs a shim, no thicker than a playing card, right here." Helm whirled around, glaring. "Fallow, "What are you rambling about, you simpleton? You're a sweeper." Silas felt the old definition try to shove him back into the shadows. Simpleton. Scatterbrain. He gripped his hands, remembering the complex chaos of his engine, the one thing Ethelberg had not defined. "I am a sweeper, sir, but I also see the mechanism," Silas said, his voice gaining strength. "The binding is not the spring itself, it is the pressure on the spring. If you attempt to force the barrel loose, the spring will break. If you remove the pressure at the rear bearing, the tension will release safely." Helm stared, then looked back at the chief clockmaker, who shrugged. The man knew Silas was a simpleton, but he had no better idea. "Fine!" Helm snarled, desperate. "Do it, Fallow. If you break it, you will spend the rest of your worthless life paying the fine." Silas nodded, already reaching for his pocket. He didn't use a professional tool. He pulled out a small piece of polished river eel bone he had sanded down weeks ago, a perfect tiny wedge he'd made for a tricky part of the mnemonic engine. He inserted the bone shim into the bearing plate with a steady hand. There was a low, snap-hiss sound. The mainspring barrel loosened, then spun one slow, perfect revolution, settling back into its silent, powerful neutrality. The clockworks was fixed. The town's time began to tick with renewed, flawless precision. Redefinition? Helm stared at Silas, then at the simple piece of bone, then back at Silas. He had seen compliance his whole life. This was something else. This was quiet mastery. The other staff watched, silent. The words scatterbrain and simpleton seemed to rattle and break on the floor like fallen brass filings. Helm cleared his throat, adjusting his waistcoat. He couldn't praise a simpleton, not out loud. "Fallow," he spat, "go back to your sweeping and clean up that mess you made." Silas didn't move. The fear had dissipated from his own chest, replaced by the humming energy of purpose. "Master Helm," Silas said, looking him directly in the eye, "I fixed your machine. I didn't break it. My name is Silas Fallow, and I am not a sweeper. I am a clockwork architect. I will be finishing my contract here, and then I will be opening my own workshop." He looked at the small shim of eel bone in his hand. "Your conformity saved the town's contract, but my so-called scattered perspective saved your business. There is more than one way to organize a mind, and more than one way to build a clock." He walked, without sweeping, toward the back corner. He reached under the canvas and pulled aside the sacks, revealing the magnificent, multi-faced mnemonic engine. Its 7 mechanisms whirred quietly, perfectly in sync. The other clockmakers gasped. They didn't see a scatterbrain's mess. They saw a dizzying display of ingenuity, a machine built from their own trash that was more beautiful than anything they had ever produced. Silas picked up the last piece, the balance mechanism, and fitted it perfectly into the engine's center. He wound the piece, and the engine hummed, its work complete. He left the next day. He took the mnemonic engine and the small piece of eel bone with him. He opened his own workshop on the edge of Ethelberg. The townspeople tried, initially, to define him. They called his beautiful, complex creations scatterclocks. They muttered that he was a simpleton who got lucky, But when the royal inspector came to town, it wasn't Helm's predictable perfect clocks that caught his eye. It was Silas's mnemonic engine, the magnificent, organized chaos of a mind that refused to be limited. The inspector smiled. "This," he announced, "is not the work of a simpleton. This is the work of a visionary, a true original." And for the first time, Ethelberg heard a word defining one of their own that they could not argue against, because the beautiful, undeniable truth stood before them, ticking with its own triumphant time. Silas, the former simpleton, was finally free of their dictionary, defined only by the magnificent work of his own hands and the unwavering conviction in his own mind.